This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
I want you to imagine yourself in a garden. It's a beautiful, warm spring afternoon. The sun is shining, the temperature is perfect, and sweet music, like what you just heard, fills the air. But this is no ordinary garden. Rather, we find ourselves in the ballroom grove, one of the many secretive alcoves that populates King Louis XIV's magnificent garden at the Palace of Versailles. Of course, many princes and lords have impressive gardens by this point, but none can match the majesty of the Sun King. Before you is a semicircular amphitheater, flanked with terraced hedges. In the center, water flows gently over rows of stone, creating a calming, peaceful sound. At the bottom of the amphitheater is a small pool, with jets of water that shoot up 5 to 10 feet in the air. The edges of this magnificent structure are flanked with large golden urns, creating a beautiful mix of gold, gray, and green. But this space, as stunning as it is meant only to be a backdrop. In the clearing immediately before it is a small stage, where the finest dramatists and musicians in France will ply their trades. Now today we have come to see a ballet comedy by the great Molière, called Les Amants Magnifiques, or the Magnificent Lovers. The story concerns two rival princes who fight for the hand of a beautiful princess. Although, unbeknownst to them, she has just fallen herself for a soldier of fortune. We are here for the comedy, of course, but also to listen to the music, in this case composed by Louis's own official court composer, Jean-Baptiste Lully. But today, we are in for a special treat. For not only will we witness the greatest and most talented actors in all the land, but Louis himself will also take the stage, playing the role of Apollo, Greek god of sun, light, music, and poetry. Now, if you're having trouble picturing this scene, I recommend watching its recreation in the 2000 movie Le Roi Danse, or The King Dances, which gives us a dramatization of life inside Louis's court, complete with all the lavishness, debauchery, the drama and intrigue that was found there. Incidentally, the piece of music that I played at the beginning of today's podcast was taken from that movie's original soundtrack. Now, the movie itself is great. It was also filmed on location in the ballroom grove itself. If you watch the clip online, you can actually see this scene with Louis XIV played by a young Benoit Magimel. Now, the scene that I've been talking about is actually pretty amazing. At the beginning of it, a young, shirtless Louis emerges from the gate, covered entirely in gold. He's got gold dust in his hair, his pants are gold, his shoes are gold. Literally everything is gold. It's almost like a scene from Goldmember or even Goldfinger if you're a James Bond fan. Right, so he comes out and he slowly walks to the stage at the center of the grove. And he's carrying like a little sun mask that he puts up in front of his face. And he's almost kind of like hiding behind it because he's sort of intimidated by the crowd. Right? All of the subjects' eyes are upon him. He's breathing heavy and deliberately, clearly anxious about the complex and choreographed dance number that he will soon perform. As he mounts the stage, a courtier, who is actually part of the play, cries out things like, and I'm translating here, of course, "What elegance! What glorious bearing!" At other times, he kind of makes the voice for Apollo as he enters, saying, "I am the source of brilliance." And so this Apollo, played by Louis, then carries out an intricate ballet dance, nimbly hopping around and balancing on one foot. And he actually culminates in this incredibly difficult move, a triple pirouette. Now, his landing doesn't go too well. After all, he's wearing platform shoes, and if you can imagine, dancing around in late 17th century platform shoes, that probably wasn't too kind on the ankles. And in this case, Louis actually kind of twists his ankle as he falls. And so you're left with this moment when Louis is kind of tottering and trying to maintain his balance, and the court is kind of breathing in, what's going to happen? Is he going to be able to hold it? Is this going to be an embarrassment for everyone involved? We're just on the edge of our seats. And he deftly maintains it. But while he does, you can see in his eyes the kind of fear and anxiety as he's going through this. As I said, my description really doesn't do it justice. If you have the time, I highly recommend just Googling Le Roi Danse and watching this scene from the Magnificent Lovers when he's playing Apollo. This begs an interesting question, though, right, that we've just run through here, which is, why is the most powerful man in Europe going through all of this? As one can see in the film version especially, this doesn't really seem to bring Louis a lot of joy. He's definitely anxious about it. He's definitely physically straining to pull off all the moves. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing a powerful guy should be doing, especially in the early modern period, right? If we think about medieval and early modern ideals of masculinity and kingship, we talked about some of these before, right? They're often linked to ideals of violence, right? You want your king to be a hero, to be a warrior, to be able to fight, to be strong. That's not what we associate ballet dancing with, right? Ballet dancing is effeminate. If I said, picture in your mind a ballet dancer, you don't think of Arnold Schwarzenegger. You don't think of Sylvester Stallone. You don't think of Hugh Jackman. You probably think of like a 12-year-old girl and she's dancing in Swan Lake or the Nutcracker, right? Ballet is for girls, is the stereotype. So why is someone like Louis doing this kind of ballet, right? Why is he performing? Right? I guess performances can have value in politics. Think about kind of one of the classical moments in American political history in the last, I'd say, 30 years. It was about 30 years ago. Bill Clinton was running for president, and some people liked him, some people didn't like him. But he went on the Arsenio Hall show. And the Arsenio Hall show was like a popular kind of talk show, a little bit of variety. And at one point, he gets up and produces a saxophone. And he just starts playing the saxophone, and he's all rocking out to it and moving around. And the crowd goes wild. And for better or for worse, whether you like Clinton or not, people responded to that. People said, wow, this guy's a rock star. He's cool. This isn't some old politician up there. He's got a little charisma. And it worked for Clinton. And we've also seen plenty of athletes over the years run for office. I mean, even if they're not as nimble or mobile or strong as they once were, they run on that athleticism. They run on the fact that they were a great Hall of Fame wide receiver. They were a great offensive tackle. You can trust them. They run on their masculinity. So we get that. We get, okay, you're someone involved in politics. You always want to look masculine, or at least if you're a man, you want to look masculine. But many women now also want to look powerful and masculine. But in terms of ballet, picture a current politician trying to pull that off, right? Picture Joe Biden or Donald Trump or Boris Johnson. Or if you want to go back and use kind of like a historical example, think about JFK, right? JFK was charismatic. He was Camelot. He was young. Could probably maybe have pulled it off. Picture him trying to do little pirouettes and hopping around the stage and balancing himself on one leg. That doesn't sound like a successful political campaign, right? That sounds like a bad SNL sketch, right? What if we had all the presidents together? They were all doing ballet. So why is Louis doing this? I should point out, too, that this is not a cameo, right? I think we've all at some point in our lives I had that idea of like, well, would it be cool to be in a movie, right? Wouldn't it be cool just to play a stormtrooper in one of the Star Wars movies? Just be an extra, maybe have a line, maybe get like in a sword fight or something. I've always, I was in a theater company when I was growing up, and I've always kind of wanted to play the role of Javert in Les Mis. I've always thought he's kind of a cool and misunderstood character. Javert is like the police inspector. If you've seen the movie, he's played by Russell Crowe. Maybe I would do that if I got the chance, right? The local theater here, it's not a big deal. It's not much of a commitment. But to do the dedication to be in a ballet, to be in a production by somebody like Molière, wow. And for Louis, this isn't a cameo. He appears in over 80 roles in 40 plays over the course of his life. So why on earth would he do this? The answer is it's about performance. For his subjects, Louis was not just an actor playing the role of basically Apollo there in the spotlight. He was their Apollo. When the courtier was saying, what grace, what brilliance, you are the source of the light. Right? He's not just saying that as an actor saying lines. The message to all the other powerful people in attendance is that Louis is the center of your universe. He is your Apollo. He is your bringer of light. And so what this example is demonstrating is the way in which Louis was able to use the power of culture to perfect the practice of absolutism. To make absolutism work, not because he had the biggest army, because he said he was an absolute monarch, or because of the church. Louis figures out the cultural side of politics. He transforms his entire life, in essence, into a performance of a sort. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about the birth of absolutism, why it's created, some reactions to it, some people that are for it, obviously, some of the problems with it. But really the key takeaway that we're going to go through today is the way in which Louis is able to use the power of culture to make absolutism possible. So before we get into all of that, we want to just kind of go back over a little bit where we were. If you'll recall, we talked about the kind of buildup of a crisis of order that had kind of hit Europe somewhere in the 17th century. You can say it's a little bit earlier. You could say it's a little bit later. Depends kind of on what country you're talking about. But basically what we saw was that the nobles over time had increasingly built up their own power. And so when you have this moment, this explosion of violence that happens kind of around the period of the Reformation, states, monarchs are not able to control or stop that violence. And so that becomes particularly problematic, right? It raises the issue of, if you have widespread violence, how do we deal with that violence? How can we create order where there doesn't seem to be any at the moment? So that's kind of where we pick up, where we start our podcast today. There is essentially two answers that Europeans developed to that question, right? How are we going to stop violence? And the first answer is the development of absolutism. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The other answer is related to the Enlightenment, and we'll talk about that on our next podcast. But today we're going to talk about absolutism. Now, if you ask any of my students, one of the things that they'll tell you is that I am a stickler for definitions, right? We talk about history all the time. We use all these terms. The terms need to mean something more than just good or bad, right? If I say communism or socialism or fascism, I don't care if you like those ideas, if you hate those ideas, if you're anti, if you're anti-anti, if you're anti-anti-anti, but I want you to know what you're talking about. I want those things to mean more than just good or bad, right? If I say absolutism, my guess is that most of you would say, that's not a good thing. We don't like absolutism. That doesn't sound good. In fact, many of my students will conflate that term absolutism with the idea of dictatorship. What does it mean to be an absolutist monarch? Well, it means you can do whatever you want, right? You're a dictator. Your word is law. Not quite. I can see where that comes from. Obviously, the idea of absolute, right? Seems absolute power, absolute monarch. Not really any limits on something that's absolute. But we want to drill down and define that definition just a little bit more. And we'll do this, again, throughout the period, throughout the course. We want everyone to have a clear sense of what it is that they're talking about so you can critique it, you can support it, you can explain why certain things related to this phenomenon led to other things, right? We always want to be as specific as possible. So if absolutism is not dictatorship, what is it? Well, a short part of the answer is it deals with this idea of something called sovereignty. And sovereignty is one of those sort of intellectual concepts. It's very difficult to define. It's a poli-sci, political, kind of philosophical concept. But the sort of simple definition of sovereignty is that it's where the authority of a state comes from. I live right now in the United States of America. Where does the government get the right to pass laws? Why should I recognize its authority and not the authority of, let's say, my church or synagogue, or my basketball team, or my town, or if I was in a union, my union? Right? Why does the state get recognized as having all that power? And in particular, the federal and to some extent the state governments here in the United States. Well, the answer is that sovereignty in the United States lies in the government, and the government has it because it comes from the people. Right? It is a democratic society in the sense that there is a belief in a nation, and that nation expresses its will through elections. And those elected leaders then make decisions on behalf of the people they represent. And if the people don't like the decisions that those politicians have made, they could vote for other people. In an absolutist system, sovereignty does not come from historical or natural rights. It is not located in a state, in a set of institutions, but sovereignty comes from the ruler, from the king or the queen. And that's really where the source of law comes from. The state is me, is a famous saying. Probably doesn't sound too revolutionary, right? Again, we have this modern conception of dictatorship, right? The idea that a Stalin, a Hitler, a Lenin, maybe less Lenin, but certainly someone like Stalin or Hitler, the idea that they would say, oh, okay, I'm the one that makes the laws. It all starts with me. That doesn't seem too strange to us, right? It's more complicated even in some of those historical examples that I just made. But the idea that a dictator says, this is what I want things to be, and that's what it is because sovereignty comes through me, that doesn't seem that revolutionary to us. But in the 17th century, it was extraordinarily revolutionary. Because one of the things that kings are saying here is not just that I'm the king and I'm the top of the sort of social pyramid, but they are saying there is no such thing as historical right. All you barons and bishops and nobles and archdukes and counts and Castilians and all you people out there, where do your historical traditions come from? Where do your laws that you say are historical rights, where do those come from? Right? You say you have the right to habeas corpus, the right not to be imprisoned without a trial. Where did you get those rights from? The noble would say, well, we had a negotiation with the previous monarch, and I won those rights in perpetuity. I won those rights. They are historical rights, or my family won those rights. Therefore, they must always exist because they were agreed to at some point in the past. An absolute monarch would say, maybe you signed a deal with King John way back in 1215. But sovereignty doesn't lie in the past. It lies in the present. It lies solely in myself. And therefore, if I want to change it, if I want to revoke historical rights that were granted, then I can do that. And so absolutism isn't just the idea the king says, oh, I have complete power. It's the idea that the king says that he or the queen, if it's a she, is the source of all law. And therefore, all of the rights and all of the power that nobles have historically acquired can be thrown out the window. That's pretty revolutionary. Now, this conversation doesn't take place in a vacuum, but it plays out also amid a process of centralization. So as these monarchs begin to come out and say, look, I am an absolute monarch. Sovereignty comes from me. One of the things they start doing is building up more of a centralized state, right? So the king can't personally exercise that sovereignty everywhere. Even a smaller country like Austria, country like Spain, right? We talked about all these difficulties of how hard it is to get from point A to point B. Talked about how difficult it was for kings and queens to project power. So what you need to help you is a bureaucracy, are institutions. And we'll see how they start creating these centralized authorities that then can go and carry out the will of the king, to enforce his rights, to enforce his prerogatives. You have nobles that are in the kind of periphery of a kingdom. They don't want to pay their taxes, or maybe they're exempt from taxes, so you come up with new taxes. They don't want to supply the military forces that they're supposed to, or the in-kind contributions they're supposed to. Well, you have a representative of the king who will go there and now start to carry out the king's authority, carry out his orders. Someone who is loyal not to the region, who doesn't have a family that they're loyal to, but whose loyalty is primarily to the king. Now, so far, if you are a king, it's pretty obvious why you would want to claim all this power, right? It's, to paraphrase a scene from a Mel Brooks movie called The History of the World Part 1, it's good to be the king. It's good to have all that power. And if we said today in most democratic societies, should we just give absolute power to someone? Most people would say, I don't know if I like that idea. At least historically, that's been the case in the United States. And even people who have centralized power in the United States, people, let's say, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or if you wanted to use a non-American example, someone like Vladimir Putin. Right? Even then, they kind of couch what they're doing in the idea that they're not really a dictator. Right? People do have some sort of say. We'll see this was true of communist dictatorships in the 1940s and afterwards as well. But there were popular voices in the 17th century and 18th centuries who said, actually, this idea of an absolute monarch is just what we need. It's absolutely, no pun intended, it's absolutely the right way to go. It's the perfect form of government. Now, some of those most prominent voices were men of the church, of the Catholic Church. Catholics, very aware of the idea of hierarchy, right? You have the Pope, who is sort of God's lieutenant on earth. The Pope is maybe general, maybe he's more than a lieutenant. But the Pope is supposed to be the head of the church, guiding the church, carrying out God's plan, right? In the Catholic imaginary, and I would argue for most Christians as well, God didn't just create the world so, we could mess around and it's kind of like a soap opera and, who's doing this week and intrigue and entertainment. That's more the kind of Greco-Roman model, right? Zeus is coming down to mess with the poor mortals because he's basically bored. In the Christian model, there is a plan, and God is not there making the plan happen in a way that we can just obviously see, where we see God and, okay, here comes this or that. God works through intermediaries on earth, the highest being the Pope, but also the cardinals, the archbishops, your parish priest, right? You don't just go to heaven. You need sacraments. And those sacraments have to be performed by someone in the church. And God knows this, so part of his plan was to put people there to help you do the sacraments to get you to heaven. By the time you get to the 18th century, by the time we have all this violence, and especially you have all these reformers, and the church says, you know what, it's not enough to have just the Pope. We can also think of the king as God's lieutenant on earth. Now, for those of you that are medievalists out there, who love medieval history, it's worth noting that there is this idea of the king being sort of God's representative that does go back to the medieval period, right? Go back to even Constantine. Constantine is kind of a vessel through which God is supposedly achieving his plan. But there are members of the church that become very, very passionate supporters of the idea of absolutism, or what they like to call divine right monarchy. And so a great example of this is a guy named Bishop Bossuet, Bossuet. Bossuet lived in France in the end of the 17th century, very beginning of the 18th century. He dies, and after he's dead, they publish this volume called Politics Drawn from the Very Words of Holy Scripture. Right, so he's anchoring this kind of political argument in Scripture, in Catholic teachings. And in that book, he wrote, "Princes act as ministers of God and as his lieutenants on earth." And so as a result, kings are not just making their own decisions, deciding, I want to fight this war, I want to do that, we should have this tax. You need to think of it in the larger picture, where the king is there to carry out God's mission on earth. Now think about the stakes of this statement. If the king says that you need to carry out some action, you need to pay some tax or provide some service, that's not just the king saying, hey, do me a favor. Hey, you owe me money, let's pay it. That is God saying that you need to take a certain action. Subjects do not have the right to rebel because they don't like how things are going in Bossuet's mindset. Subjects are supposed to follow the will of the king because it is really the will of God. Now, that doesn't sound too great if you're not the king, right? That sounds like dictatorship. And I said these aren't the same things, dictatorship and absolutism, so what's the difference? Well, here's the difference, right? In this situation, the king does not act independently of God's will. The king doesn't get to say, I'm the king, I don't really feel like doing poor relief anymore. I'm the king of Spain and I just feel like invading Portugal, so I'm just going to do it because I feel like it. Kings are not supposed to do that stuff. Kings are supposed to be working for God. Now, there is a kind of trick to the system, which is, okay, who enforces it? And what Bossuet basically says is that the person or the thing that's enforcing these moral codes is God himself. So if you are a wicked king, if you're King John from Robin Hood, it's not that the terrestrial forces are going to rise up and overthrow you in the name of God. We don't want to do that. That's rocking the boat too much. But what will happen is God himself will render judgment upon you. If you are a wicked king, perhaps you'll get leprosy. Maybe you'll die from plague. Right? Remember, we talked about in one of our first episodes, this was a religious world. People believed that the supernatural impacted in very direct and immediate ways the material world. It's not surprising to see why kings would have really appreciated the voice like Bossuet, making that kind of religious argument for traditionalism, for structure, for obedience, and really for stability. But Bossuet was not the only one making that type of argument. Indeed, the church was not the only one making that type of argument. Another guy that you might have heard of is a man named Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was someone who lived in the very late 16th century. He lived for a long time, lived into most of the 17th century. He was English, but he spent a lot of time outside of England. And he's known today primarily for his political philosophy. But Hobbes is one of these amazing guys who's like writing political philosophy in the morning, and then in the afternoon he'll go do some astronomy. Maybe at night he'll do some mathematics. Some of these guys are passionate naturalists. They're part of the very beginnings of the Enlightenment. So Hobbes is kind of a Renaissance man. He's also a very good writer. He's also very strong in his beliefs, one should say. And as he looks around at people living in the 17th century, he says, wow, we human beings, we Europeans at least, we are very animal-like. We're selfish, we're impulsive. If we think about the idea of human nature, Hobbes would say it's really drawn from the jungle. Right? Some of you may be familiar with a book called Lord of the Flies. It was made into a movie. When I was growing up, they used to make everybody watch the movie or read the book. Now, I don't know what you guys do. But Lord of the Flies was basically about these English schoolboys that are on the younger side, although there's a range of ages. And basically they're involved in I believe it's a plane crash, And so all the adults are killed and they're just living without any guidance on this island. And over the course of time, they become increasingly savage, right? They descend from civilization into violence. And Thomas Hobbes would have liked that book. Hobbes said that basically people are pretty mean to each other. Like I said, they're selfish. They're always thinking about themselves. We would be in a lot of trouble were it not for a second quality of people, which is that while people are, again, very self-centered, they're also rational. People have the ability to realize that if we're only thinking of ourselves, that leads to violence. If we didn't have such a thing as property rights, if we just said, take whatever you want and it's survival of the fittest and whoever is the strongest can take it, right? If it's kind of kindergarten rules, well, then we'd always be fighting each other. And no one would ever feel comfortable because there would always be the potential for someone else to steal or kill. So Hobbes says that people basically use their minds and they begin to realize that if they work together, they can overcome some of those circumstances. And so government then is basically a contract where all the people in a society get together and say, okay, this person will become king or queen in exchange for our loyalty, in exchange for giving up our right to rebel. The king has to provide us with peace and justice. Hobbes isn't the only one who thinks of things in terms of a contract. Some of you may be familiar with a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau that we'll talk about later in a different podcast, comes up with this idea of the social contract. John Locke, another kind of early modern political philosopher, lawyer, thinking about, the nature of government in terms of being a contract. But Hobbes, unlike some of those other guys, does not think that this is a contract you really can ever get out of. In fact, he says it's actually much more likely that people are going to rebel and create problems than it is that a king or queen is going to violate their mandate, right? So obedience is critical in Hobbes's kind of system. Hobbes put all this together in a book that he called The Leviathan, published in 1651. And again, it kind of made this argument for a strong, centralized state as being an antidote to all of the violence that was going on. Somewhat surprisingly, Hobbes's book was not very popular. It's actually, one would argue, more popular today than it was at the time. And there's a number of reasons for this. The one that I just want to highlight very quickly is, even if you were an absolute monarch, there's a tendency to reject Hobbesian thinking, because even as Hobbes is saying, well, you should have all this power, the origin of that does not come from God. The origin comes from subjects. And so even absolute monarchs are a little bit nervous about some of the brew here that Hobbes is cooking up. Another problem is Hobbes's goal is to create a peaceful society. But if you are an absolute monarch, if you're a king, how do you win glory? You win glory by fighting wars. Right? You want to be able to go to your subjects and say, give me support, give me money, give me soldiers, not because we have to defend the realm, but because I need to win glory. Okay. So far, so good, right? We're talking about this idea of building up the absolute monarchy. Sounds pretty good. If you were a king or a queen and it's about the year 1600 and you heard about these philosophies, you probably would say, yeah, that makes sense. I think I should have all the power. But as we know, as we saw in our discussions of power so far, power is not what you have written down on a piece of paper. Power is not making a claim and saying that you have the right to do something. Power is actually being able to do it. And so this idea of absolutism, while it might sound nice in theory, in practice is much harder to pull off. So we have, as an example of this, the figure of Charles I. Charles I was the King of England, kind of like the early to middle part of the 17th century. And Charles begins that same process of centralization that we saw elsewhere, right? Charles is trying to build up the power of the crown. Charles obviously has this thing called Parliament that he's got to deal with from time to time. He's not particularly fond of Parliament. They're sort of a pain in the butt. Now, like all good monarchs, Charles gets involved in a number of wars. In his case, actually, it's less his problem than what Elizabeth and Henry VIII had done, right? They both spent tremendous sums of money Both had very lavish courts. They kind of stuck him with the bill, right? How am I going to pay for all of these debts? If I call the nobles, if I try to get it from Parliament, Parliament will try to squeeze more historical rights out of me. And so Charles basically tries to raise taxes to pay for not only his own things, but spending that his previous monarchs had done as well. Now, another problem is that Charles is still wrestling with the legacy of the Reformation. Right? And so Charles is trying to figure out, Anglicans, Puritans, Catholics, how does everybody fit together in this English state? What do we do about these Presbyterians up in Scotland? They're Calvinists. That the English royal family by this point and the Scottish royal family had very strong links to each other. But one was Protestant and the other was Catholic. After Henry VIII converts, Scotland starts to become reformed as well, but they go for something called Calvinism, which is a little more radical, led by a guy named John Knox. And from time to time, as the English are wont to do, they like to stroll up to Scotland and invade and try to reorganize things to their benefit. So Charles, basically, by the year 1640, gets caught up in intrigues in Scotland. He needs money to pay for war. Eventually, he's forced to call Parliament to try to get those payments authorized. But Parliament doesn't want to give him those payments. And so for about 2 or 3 years, they go back and forth. They're fighting with each other. They're trying to force each other to kind of give in. And finally, Charles finds that there are, I believe, 5 members of Parliament who are suspected of conspiring with the Scots. So the English invade Scotland. The Scots, like to raid down into Northumbria and other parts of the northern part of England. And so Charles tries to pressure Parliament into arresting these guys, violating their historical rights. Those members of Parliament don't want to allow the king to do this. Once you set this a precedent, then it could happen all the time. And so basically things degenerate so that by 1642, both sides start to answer the question over raising money by basically raising armies. And so they actually start a war between Parliament and the king. This war went on for about 4 years until 1646, and eventually Charles's side lost. At the start of 1649, he was tried for treason. There's kind of parallels here to what will happen 150 years later to Louis XVI in France in 1789. Execution is 1792-93 is when the kind of main part of that happens. But Charles is tried and executed. So again, being able to make up a claim for power, having your institutions say that this power exists, it does not necessarily make it so. Right? We'll get later in the semester into the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. There were institutions passing laws. There were heads of state making proclamations about what should be. But by 1989, it didn't matter anymore because people had lost faith in those institutions. They didn't care what they had to say. And events kind of overtook in many places the will of political leaders. So claiming you have power and actually exercising power are very different things. So how do you pull off absolutism? Well, there's a couple ways that you can start to do this. And these ways actually precede Louis XIV, who again is the master at making this work, right? He is the number one all-time greatest absolute monarch. One of those things that we talked about before was institution building, right? And we can see this going back to Henry IV of France or later on someone like Louis XIII. Louis XIII, not as interested in day-to-day aspects of government, but his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, is. Richelieu was basically a guy who worked his way up through the church bureaucracy, got involved in kind of political intrigues at the court, proved his Machiavellian bona fides, proved that he was an effective kind of manager. And so one of the things that they start doing in France under Cardinal Richelieu is they start centralizing power. They create something called départements, or departments. These are administrative units. And the administrative units are not based on historical areas of sort of collective belonging, but they're based more on reason and rationality. And Napoleon will carry out something similar once he comes to power, another round of revisions. Within these 32 départements, they're called généralités. Napoleon calls them départements. The translation of généralité is departement. But anyways, for each of these 32, he creates something called an intendant. And the intendant is basically going to be a guy who can act in the name of the king. The intendant recruits men for the army, collects taxes, administers justice, performs other royal tasks, right? So he's like a miniature version of the king, except he's only there so long as the king lets him be. Now, another important thing that starts under Cardinal Richelieu but continues into Louis XIV's time is that these intendants don't stay there permanently. You want to move your intendant around so that they cannot create a local power base, so that they cannot win the loyalty of the population and become even more popular than the king. Now, another part of Louis XIV's strategy that again sort of starts with Richelieu is we don't want to call the parliament. We don't want to call the Estate Générale, which is like the French version of parliament in England, right? It's a meeting of the nobles and other learned members of the community, church, leading merchants, doctors, lawyers, that kind of thing. We don't want all those people getting together because when they get together, they start plotting against us. So we'll just never have them meet. Think about if you were trying to have a conversation with someone the old-fashioned way, or you're writing letters to each other, versus if you could just be in a room together and talk things out. So we start to see this process of institution building that then again carries forward into Louis XIV's day. Louis XIV will not call the Estate Générale during his lifetime. Louis XV will not call a meeting of the Estate Générale during his lifetime. Louis XVI only does it because he's forced to, and as we know, it kind of blows up in his face. Another way we see this process of centralization playing out is through getting rid of some of those historical rights that allowed people to be different or that allowed people sort of different conditions. Now in France, one of the things that we've kind of already talked about is in the 16th century, we have these huge wars of religion, right? The Reformation comes, the idea that you would have a king who is not a Catholic becomes enormously problematic. We talked about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in the 1570s. One of the solutions to that is carried out by Henry IV. Henry IV is a Protestant who has converted to Catholicism. One of Henry's solutions to ending the wars of religion is basically to grant Protestants civil rights. Under Henry, if you are a Protestant, which is called a Huguenot, you should be able to get any position in the kingdom. You should be able to worship freely without facing the Inquisition. And so Henry issued this thing called the Edict of Nantes in 1598. Another thing that it says, which is probably really important, is that Protestants can fortify their towns. And in fact, the king will help subsidize some of these towns, like a port named La Rochelle. And so in the short run, this is great, right? Okay, Catholics will go about your business. Protestants, we're not going to pick on you anymore. Isn't everybody happy? But over the course of time, this becomes a problem. When in the 1620s, the French monarchs decide, okay, we're going to try to build other ports. Besides La Rochelle, we're going to invest in other ports because we want to develop mercantilism. We want to develop these colonies that we're starting to find in the New World. Those Huguenots in La Rochelle will rebel. When they don't want to pay taxes, they rebel. So what do? Well, part of the answer for Louis XIV is you repeal that edict. And that's exactly what happens in 1685. He basically says, we will no longer tolerate Protestantism in France. France is a Catholic country. If you live here, you must be a Catholic. You must adhere to the rights of the church. If you don't like it, leave it. And over 400,000 of these Huguenots wind up leaving. Some of them come to the United States. Many of them look for other Protestant countries where they can be openly Protestant. A place like the Netherlands, which is Protestant and not very far away, very tolerant society, that seems like a really great place to go. And many of these 400,000 will go there or will go to the Dutch colony in the southern tip of Africa. Now, there's a little state in kind of central Europe, north central Europe, called Brandenburg, Prussia. It's got this little backwater town called Berlin when this happens in the 1680s. But it is a Protestant country, Protestant state. So this little backwater says, hey, if you are a French Huguenot and you want religious freedom, please come to Berlin. And so part of the story as to how Prussia rises is that it basically takes in tens of thousands of Huguenot refugees who are educated, who have skills, who have military experience, who have money. And so this helps raise the communities that these refugees end up going to. On the flip side, for Louis, Protestantism remains illegal until just before the start of the French Revolution. It's actually Louis XVI, ironically, that will finally implement some tolerance in France. But what it does for Louis is it strengthens the position of the Catholic Church, who, by the way, are saying absolutism is a good idea, we should have divine right. So it works for him. Another thing Louis does, which again you can see a past precedent for, is that he intimidates his nobles. And actually we have a really useful example from his predecessor, Louis XIII, which had to deal with this execution of a guy named Henry II, Duke of Montmorency. So this Duke Henry is not just a random guy, but he's actually the godson of Henry IV. He is a very, very popular guy at court. He ends up being named an admiral when he's basically a young man, late teenage years, early 20s. Fights in a number of wars, defeats a bunch of Protestants. They actually make him a Marshal of France and the governor of the southern province of Languedoc. However, in 1632, he joins the king's brother in rebellion. Now remember, these rebellions were not necessarily attempts to seize power. Sometimes they were just ways of expressing dissatisfaction with royal policies. So it's not uncommon for nobles to get wrapped up in one faction or another. However, Richelieu does not like this Duke Henry, and basically he has him captured and condemned and executed for treason. For us to say, well, you're guilty of treason, the penalty is death, that seems pretty obvious and pretty normal. But for people living at the time, especially nobles, they thought they had all these historical rights. They thought, okay, maybe you do that to the leaders of a peasant rebellion, the village is having problems, but you're the former king's godson. You're a marshal, a grand admiral. You don't just kill those types of people. But they did. Okay, so we've talked about some of the kind of basic things that are going on. Of course, Charles is trying this. Other absolute monarchs are trying it. What is it that makes Louis so successful? Why is he so good at this where so many others fail? The short answer to that question is that it comes from culture. Louis transforms his entire life into a performance and understands how those interactions, rituals, daily routine, who you reward and who you punish, all of these things can be used to win over the loyalty of the nobility. That power, to say it more directly, power often comes from culture. Right, I said in a previous episode, how would I answer this kind of debate between Littlefinger and Circe about, what is the nature of power? Who really has power? Power, you have power when people believe you have power. And Louis was a master at using culture to convince others and to show others that he had power. So how does he do that? He does that a couple ways. Probably the most spectacular, the most famous, is the building of the Palace of Versailles. Versailles starts off as basically a little hunting cottage. We say little hunting cottage. It wasn't that little, right? It was built for Louis XIII. But Louis XIV falls in love with it. Right, it's about 12 miles outside of Paris. Before this, monarchs are living in downtown Paris. It's dirty, it's crowded. There's always that kind of threat of rebellion. Why not move out to the countryside? And so Louis begins construction on a sort of mature version of the Palace of Versailles in 1661. After about 20 years, it's big enough that he can move his permanent residence to Versailles, or I should say his major residence, because all these kings have multiple residences. They tend to move around a lot. But the main residence for the French kings up until the French Revolution will be the Palace of Versailles. Now, the palace, of course, as many of you know, is enormous, right? It's over 700,000 square feet. Right, most families today, your family of, mom and dad and 2.3 kids and a dog and a cat, most families are probably going to be in about 2,000 to 3,000 square feet. Maybe 4,000 if you got a bigger, newer house. 4,000, 4,500 square feet, that's pretty big. You're starting to get into mansion sizes there, or at least, like old school Southern plantation style mansions. Palace of Versailles, 700,000 square feet. It also contains gardens that are approximately 3 square miles. Massive gardens that, if you've ever been to the Palace of Versailles, you can't walk the whole things in a full day. I mean, physically, maybe you could, but it's too much. It's draining. These gardens are so big that he built a giant Grand Canal that was about a mile long. And he had his own little flotilla. So if he was at the hunting lodge and he wanted to go, out on a boat, not just go out on a boat in the middle of a pond, but you could go onto a mile-long man-made lake, which in the 17th century, that's pretty impressive. Another thing that kind of, again, shows this status off. We talked in our last podcast about these wealthy people like Francois I. They're building these enormous palaces, showing off all their wealth and power. Louis XIV was very good at doing this just in the material sense, right? One of the things that he builds and develops is called the orangerie. And the orangerie in French is basically like the place of the oranges. So Louis grew thousands of orange trees, right? As he built this kind of palace, the idea was that he would be able to get citrus fruit. Nowadays, we don't really think about this much. You want an orange, go down to the grocery store. You can buy an orange. Most of you have never thought about, is it January? Is it September? Is it the season for growing oranges, right? We have a global sort of trade network. So if it's winter here in the northern hemisphere, it's summer in the southern hemisphere. If it's, Florida has great growing weather, Florida will supply you with oranges for many parts of the year. But, when it gets too cold in September, October, then maybe you'll get oranges from someplace else. We don't have that back in the day, right? Oranges don't last long enough to transport. And the transport itself isn't very effective. So Louis builds this thing called the orangerie with all these orange trees in it. And when it gets cold, which it gets cold in the late 17th century and the 18th century, France is a very cold place to be, right? It's during something called the Little Ice Age. Well, you pull the plants inside, you heat rooms for these oranges. So imagine being from a different country and you come to the court of Louis XIV and there are these things called oranges that are so sweet, so delicious. And you say, wow, this must be a powerful guy. Now, Louis goes further than this. Again, he is the master of building palaces, the master of showing off wealth. One of the things that we didn't really talk about so much is the art style that's coming into play in the late 17th and especially the 18th centuries, where there's going to be a focus on kind of a mathematical grid system. Right? You want to show with your landscapes horizontal and vertical lines because they show order. They show rationality. They show mathematics. Of course, we can't talk about Versailles without also talking about the fountains. The entire property contained more than 50 of these fountains, and some of them are massive and amazing sort of artistic works. Probably the most famous is the Bassin d'Apollon, or the Fountain of Apollo. And it shows Apollo in his chariot, and he's kind of coming out of the dawn, and he's bringing the sun and he's bringing the dawn to the world. And Louis liked to associate himself with the sun god because he said, look, I'm the sun king. I'm the center of your universe, right? The sun is in many ways the center of our universe, not just humans, but animals as well, right? Plants, certainly. And so what's really cool about it is they became interested in questions of perspective. And so it's not just a chariot, but it's him emerging from the water. And so the lines, the perspectives are really fascinating. All of this is well and good. All of this is important. And all of this is being carried out to some extent by absolute monarchs all over Europe, right? Peter the Great, Joseph in Austria, later on, of course, Catherine in Russia as well. All of them are building palaces and trying to make them seem larger than life. What distinguishes Louis, as I mentioned, isn't just the built environment, it is the power of culture. Louis turns his entire life into a show. And that show then is what kind of gives him power. To give you what I'm talking about, let's start just with the basic sort of beginning of the day. Right? Most of us, we would just wake up. We would want some time. If you were the president or if you were, one of these Fortune 500 CEOs, you probably wake up and you want to take care of some things, right? You want to get yourself dressed. You want to read the paper, have somebody bring you breakfast. In the olden days, people would look at newspapers. Now I guess you just sit in bed and scroll through your phone, check out social media. But most powerful people like to have a little bit of time to themselves, especially right when they get up. Louis' getting up is actually a performance, right? So he wakes up. There's one guy that actually sleeps in the kind of room with him. A couple servants will come in, remove his chamber pot. We don't want to make this too realistic. But then they actually close the drapes again on his bed, right? So they kind of get him up and then stick him back in bed. And then they say, okay, now we're ready to begin the waking up process. This whole ceremony is called the lever. There's a kind of petit lever that sort of begins it. And then there's the grand lever where, you bring in more and more people. But anyways, the main lever starts at 8:15 in the morning. The Grand Chamberlain comes in and he brings in a small group of honored nobles. And they basically just sit there and watch the king get dressed. Think about that for a moment. One, think about it from the king's side, especially if you're a very wealthy and powerful person. Do you want people coming in to watch you get dressed in the morning? Maybe there's somebody who's super vain out there and some actor or actress, like a Ryan Reynolds or a Jennifer Lopez maybe back in the day, say, okay, I want people to come in and look at me, look at how sculpted my body is. But probably not, right? I don't think, if you're Joe Biden, if you're Donald Trump, if you're Boris Johnson, maybe Vladimir Putin would want to do this. If you're Angela Merkel, do you want people watching you get dressed in the morning? No, of course not. But Louis did. And as the process went on, as he got more and more dressed, as he shaved, as he did all his kind of activities, the Grand Chamberlain would actually say, okay, now I'm going to let in another group of nobles. And now I'm going to let in a third group of notable people. And all of them are there just watching him get dressed. Again, as this is taking place, if we went back in time, if we were in a time machine and we witnessed this, I think a lot of us would just be like, what? Like, why would anyone want to go and watch an old man get dressed? Right? Why? When Louis XIV was 63 years old, why would you want to go watch a 63-year-old man getting dressed? That seems like you would say that like in Vegas and people would be like, I don't know if we can provide that service. Why would you want to do that? The answer is about the idea of access. The answer is that as we build up this bureaucratic state, as there are more and more people between you and the king, it becomes harder and harder to influence policies, to influence decisions, to gain the will and the favor of the king. Think about it this way. Most of us live in democratic societies. Theoretically, our representatives are beholden to us. Have you ever written an email or made a phone call to your representative? If you live here in the United States, think about if you tried to email your senator. My senators right now are Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott. If I sent Tim Scott an email, I said, hey, I'm Dr. Jason Hansen. I am concerned about funding for police departments. Firefighters are great people. They sacrifice a lot for us. I think that we need more money for them. What do you think the chances are that Tim Scott is going to read that? Or Lindsey Graham or whoever your senator is or your congressman? They represent millions of people. Like even the smallest ones represent at least tens of thousands of people, usually hundreds of thousands of people. And even if they did see it, who's this, a professor at a university writing about something that's not, their expertise? Okay, that's nice. I'll listen to it, but, not going to spend time thinking about it. Because chances are the senators are never reading that email. Chances are there's an intern, there's someone in that office. Now, if I had connections, let's say when Mark Sanford was the governor of South Carolina, and he was a Furman graduate, and I said, I'm a professor here at Furman, and I would like to get the help of one of your friends in setting up a talk for students. Well, now I bet I could make that connection happen. I bet my chances are a lot better because I know someone, because I can rely on personal networks. How do you develop personal networks? It comes from personal contact. When you are the first one to get to see Louis XIV wake up in the morning, and you walk in and you say, Your Majesty, you are looking so strong this morning. Your Majesty, I was so blown away by your performance in Les Amants Magnifiques last night. It was the best dancing I have ever seen. Now you are developing connections, direct connections. Now, when you try to contact Louis, or maybe you come in another time and you say, Louis, this morning, you look wonderful, but, we have had severe, famine going on in my village. Can you please give us some relief? Now you have a direct audience with Louis. That is valuable. That is something worth competing for. That intern that works for a senator today, 10 years from now, when they decide they want to get a job and they need the senator's help, that senator's going to remember them. That senator's going to do something for them if they can, or representative or whatever, right? But you get the idea. Now, Louis is smart enough to say, not only do I want to create this system where now nobles and other famous people and notables are jockeying to try to get into my bedroom in the morning to see me wake up, but the idea that they're doing that is also powerful. I want people all over the Palace of Versailles. I want them to see that it's going on. It's not enough just to create the competition. I want people to see that there's the competition so that they know there's the competition, so that they also know, hey, you're competing for the favor of someone who is powerful. I don't want to get into too much about contemporary politics, but, there's kind of an example of this from American history rather recently, right? Donald Trump, before he became president, ran this show called The Apprentice. The Apprentice was all about people competing for his favor. Millions of people saw people competing for Trump's favor and said, this Trump guy must be pretty powerful. He must be pretty good at business. He must be pretty wealthy. Again, I don't want to get into the politics of it. I don't want to get into whether that's accurate or inaccurate. Well, what I'm saying is Louis XIV had that same phenomenon going on and was doing it very intentionally. He didn't have TV, obviously. He didn't have basically reality TV shows that he could do, but he did the next best thing. If you go to the Palace of Versailles and you look at Louis XIV's windows, they are enormous. That is not an accident. That is not because he just liked to open the drapes in the morning and look out and, oh, there's the sun. It was so people could see into his bedroom and see that the lords of France, the most powerful people in France, were competing for his favor. This doesn't come without a cost. When you think about large windows in the 17th and 18th centuries, the bigger your window, the more draft there's going to be in the wintertime. And as I mentioned, France in the wintertime, especially the northern part, is cold in the 17th and 18th centuries. Louis has a fireplace, but it's a lot smaller than you might expect. Why is that? Because you couldn't have too heavy of a roof, you couldn't have too big of a chimney, and still support those large windows. And so rather than being warm, Louis says, I need to be seen. This is what I'm talking about when I say Louis understood culture and power. Louis understood nobles who didn't want to play that game, who looked up at the nobles that were in his room and said, that looks stupid, I don't want to do that. Louis understood that those nobles needed to be punished. They were not rewarded. In fact, their rivals might be rewarded. And so again, one of these secrets to power is rewarding people who advance your interests and punishing people who don't. Louis's life is replete with these examples of culture being power. Another kind of core thing that everybody does, most of us at least every day, is eat. Now, most medieval kings, you want to have a big kind of banquet table. You want to have as many people sitting with you as possible because that shows how popular you are. Not Louis. If you go to the dining room at the Palace of Versailles, you'll see that his table is very small. There's only room for a handful of additional guests at the table. Instead, what he has a little bit, maybe about 3 feet back from the table, is there's this row of chairs that kind of surrounds his table. And so what it was is that he would invite maybe 1 or 2 people, kind of very honored guests, to sit at the table and eat with him, talk to him as he's eating. But there's like a second group that get in and they watch. And they're close enough to him that he can talk to them. Right? You don't talk to the king. You don't say, "Hey, Louis, what about this?" Right? But there's a conversation going on, and Louis says, well, what are the latest discoveries with botany? Tell me about these animals that you're finding in Africa. I want to know more about the pine marten, and I want to know about the animals that we found in the New World. And you happen to have someone who's very well read on botany or biology, and they're sitting there, and he says, "Oh, sire, let me tell you about these things." Now, if you're the one sitting there, and the king asks you a question and you answer it favorably, now you have more of a personal relationship with the king. Now you are moving up the social ladder. If you are a young woman and you want to be the next concubine for Louis, you want to be his next mistress, that's where you go, right? You can make eyes at him, you can flirt with him, you can do all kinds of things, right, to kind of draw his attention. Maybe get invited for a walk in the gardens afterwards. Of course, if his wife's there, that becomes a little more difficult. Although she knew, obviously, that he was not monogamous. It gets better. Louis had a third row of seats that were far back, but that went around the walls of his dining room. So there is like a third level of people who are not honored enough to be sitting close enough for the king really to talk to them, most likely, but they get to be in the room. Right? Everybody wants to be in the room. Right? If you're a Hamilton fan, the room where it happened, right? The room where it happened. People are competing with each other to get to be in the room where it happened, with the hope that one day they might get sort of promoted to the second level where they can be close enough to maybe be a part of it if the king invites them. All of Louis's life, all of his court culture that he sets up is filled with these very rigid, very regularized rituals. When Louis walks around the palace, he doesn't just walk around the palace and say, "Oh, I feel like going here." He puts on a big wig that makes him look taller. He puts on platform shoes that make him look taller. And he makes these kind of personal sacrifices to play through the game of power. Everything that goes on at Versailles is about demonstrating his power. The massive performances that take place with fireworks, that employ sometimes up to 3,000 performers. The 300 musicians and 3 ensembles that are permanently in residence at Versailles. All of that is related to power. I'll give you another example that just, again, kind of drives home how brilliant Louis is. One of the things that we talked about, if you're noble, if you want to be powerful, you want to win glory, you set up philanthropy for the arts. Louis is the king, and so he actually goes a step further. He says, "I'm going to create a Royal Academy of Painting." We don't want to just bring in the latest Italians. We want the best of the best. So he sets up this Royal Painting Academy. What do you think the entrance exam is to get into the Royal Academy of Painting, where you'll be subsidized by the state? You are supposed to paint a picture of the monarch. Now, let's say you're a young aspiring painter. You're from Montpellier in the south. You're from Lyon, kind of the central kind of mountainy area. And you have to paint a portrait of Louis to get in. Are you going to go for realism? You're going to go for criticism? Are you going to try to be as experimental as possible? Or are you going to paint the most glorious, most kick-ass painting of Louis that you can think of? Of course you're going to paint a very flattering portrait of Louis. And in fact, Louis's favorite paintings are not really of Louis. They are kind of wink, wink, but they're not technically of Louis. They are Louis dressed as historical or mythical figures, right? My painting is Louis dressed as Hercules slaying the Hydra. Yeah, okay, I like that. That's pretty good, right? Shows that I'm strong, I'm manly, virtuous. Maybe you're Charlemagne, Alexander the Great, Constantine, maybe you're Solomon. So you find these paintings of historical and mythical figures, but Louis, it's pretty clear it's Louis's face, right? It's Louis's hair. They're not hard to identify. So Louis sets up these systems that are designed to glorify him. Glorify Louis, play the game, pretend that he is this powerful man, and you in turn will be rewarded. If you are a noble, are you going to spend your time thinking about, let's all get together and let's see how we can overthrow the king, let's see how we can secure more historical rights? Or are you washed away at Versailles by the need to, quote unquote, keep up with the Joneses? Are you overwhelmed with wanting to move up the social hierarchy, competing against the other nobles, right? Are you trying to seduce these other people's wives so that you can win favor and, again, move up the ladder? And that's what happens. By the time you get to even the 1680s, right, Louis has used culture in a way to solidify power. This is why Louis is able to pull off absolutism. If you want to use kind of more modern examples, we're talking about cultures and power and things like that. This is one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin is such an effective authoritarian, because he projects power, right? There's that famous picture of him. Of course, he's riding on horseback and he doesn't have a shirt on and he's kind of jacked. And everybody's like, people are like, why are you riding around without a shirt on? Like what, Ronald Reagan didn't do that. George W. Bush didn't do that. Barack Obama didn't do that for the most part. I guess there's pictures of him like windsurfing. But it's because it was a performance. And Louis XIV was the one who mastered that. I'm going to end by just making a couple observations about absolutism before we go on to our next podcast about the Enlightenment. And then following that, of course, we'll bring all these threads together with the French Revolution. In terms of absolutism, when you have a monarch who is capable of being a rock star, who has the charisma, who has the physical ability, who has the mental ability to project power, someone like Louis XIV, absolutism is going to work pretty well, right? Absolutism is going to centralize power and enable you to squash dissent, which is then going to solve the crisis of order. The problem, though, is that you are relying on the personal virtue and perhaps vices of that king. If you have a good king, if you have Arthur, you have someone who's thinking about the welfare of his people, who's thinking about governments, then it can work. But what happens if you have a Nero, a Caligula? What happens if you have some of these medieval popes, for example, who are not particularly interested in religion, and who basically, some of them set up like brothels, essentially, out of the Vatican, what becomes the Vatican? Well, then we have a problem, right? If the king is morally suspect, if the king is lazy, if the king just wants to sleep around all day, now we might be in trouble. What if we have a wicked king? What if we have a King John out of the Robin Hood movies? Well, now there's no check on their authority, and society may suffer as a result. There's two other structural issues that come up with this. One is the alienation of the nobility. One of the things that we saw was that the nobles had increasingly, over time, gained more and more power. Absolutism breaks that power, for the most part. But what happens then to those nobles? Especially over time, as the glitz and glamour of Versailles kind of fades, the nobles can start plotting against you. They may become resentful. You create a competition. The people that lose that competition probably aren't going to like you as much anymore. Right? If you were on The Apprentice and you were the first one voted off or sent off, well, you're probably not as big a fan as you were before. The last issue deals with economics. Absolutist monarchies never really get a handle on taxation, mercantilism. They don't create a healthy economic system. And so basically they end up fighting a lot of wars. They generate a lot of debt. And in the end, that becomes enormously problematic. So as I said, we'll bring this thread back together when we talk about the French Revolution, the long-term consequences of absolutism in France, the pressure that it puts on the monarchy, the decay, one could argue, that it creates, is a big part of explaining why the French Revolution took place. Okay, well, that's our show for today. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe to History Off the Page on the streaming service of your choice. If you really liked what you heard, please support us by signing up for a monthly subscription on Patreon. For $5 a month, you'll get access to a host of additional episodes focused on narrower topics such as Jack the Ripper, the Second Industrial Revolution, or the rise of modern sports. To learn more about this, check out our website, historyoffthepage.com. So that's all for now. Join us next time as we take history off the page.